Welcome to Pop Health Week, streaming live on Healthcare Now Radio. I'm Gregg Masters, your co-host and executive producer. With me in the virtual studio is colleague and partner Fred Goldstein, co-founder and principal show host, who also serves as president at Accountable Health, LLC. Pop Health Week is your go-to platform for peer-to-peer conversation with industry leaders, innovators, and ecosystem stakeholders, including payers, providers, patients, vendors, and the regulatory communities. We come together to share the best ideas and strategies in population health management. Connect with us at www.popupstudio.productions or drop me a direct message on Twitter via @GreggMastersMPH, and that's Gregg with two G's. You can reach Fred direct on Twitter via @FSGoldstein or visit www.accountablehealthllc.com. On today's episode, we are joined by Cheryl D. Coon, PhD, Vice President of the Clinical Outcome Assessment Program, and Sonya Eremenco, MA, Executive Director of the Patient Reported Outcome Consortium at the Critical Path Institute, otherwise referred to as CPAT. Dr. Coon oversees the Patient Reported Outcome Consortium, the Electronic Clinical Outcome Assessment, or COA, Consortium, and the Rare Disease COA Consortium. She is a psychometrician with 2 decades of experience in developing and evaluating COAs for use in constructing patient-centered endpoints. Sonya Eremenco brings over 25 years of experience in the development and evaluation of patient-reported PRO measures and other clinical outcome assessments, COAs, with a focus on multicultural development, linguistic validation, and electronic implementation. Fred, the mic is yours.
Thanks so much, Gregg, and Cheryl and Sonya. Welcome to Pop Health Week.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
So why don't we start with you, Cheryl? Give us a little introduction to yourself and your background.
Sure. So I'm Cheryl Coon. I'm the Vice President of the Clinical Outcome Assessment Program here at the Critical Path Institute. My background is that I'm a psychometrician by training. I have a PhD in quantitative psychology. And in the past, a lot of people who got such a degree ended up in educational testing. So working on things like the SAT and end of grade testing in high school. But over time, it was identified that we could apply those same methods to assessing how people are doing on a health basis. So I was lucky enough to enter into the workforce at a time when there was really a need for that type of work. So I was a consultant for 20 years, helping pharmaceutical companies try to identify how to measure things that are important to patients in clinical trials. And a year and a half ago, I joined the Critical Path Institute to head up this program that is really focused on getting the patient voice measured in a reliable and valid and meaningful way in clinical trials. So the program oversees a couple of different consortia, and we also help other consortia within Critical Path Institute to help with those clinical trial endpoints. And I'd like to hand it to Sonya because she can tell you a little bit more about one of our specific consortia within the program.
Fantastic. Go ahead, Sonya.
Thank you so much, Cheryl, and great to be here, Fred. Happy to be part of this podcast. So I'm Sonya Eremenco. I'm the Executive Director of the Patient-Reported Outcome Consortium, or PRO Consortium as we call it, within the COA program at CPAT. It's one of 3 consortia within CPAT, within the program. And our focus is on pursuing qualification of COAs with FDA's COA qualification program, which enables tools to be evaluated by FDA. And if they're granted qualification, they can then be used in clinical trials without further evidence needing to support them because their validity evidence has been approved. So it's a very rigorous process. We've got 15 COAs in the qualification program and 9 therapeutic areas. And in terms of my background, I am a qualitative researcher by training, and I've done a lot of work in cross-cultural research. I have a master's degree in cross-cultural communication, so a lot of focus on translation, cross-cultural and cross-cultural equivalence, or cultural validation and equivalence. Also electronic implementation, development and validation of COA measures. And I've been with CPATH for about 8 years in various roles within the PRO consortium.
Fantastic. And for those who may not know what a COA is, could you give us a quick definition?
I'd be happy to. So a COA stands is a clinical outcome assessment, and it is a tool to measure how a patient feels, functions, or survives. And we call that phrase it's a clinical outcome, but what's really important about it is that it is used to measure clinical benefit. And clinical benefit is a positive, clinically meaningful assessment of an intervention that shows that that intervention has had a positive effect on how a patient feels, functions, and survives. And there are 4 types of COAs. The first one, and the most common one, is patient-reported outcome, which I mentioned initially. That's what our focus initially was when we started the consortium. And it is based on a patient reporting for themselves with no one else's interpretation. Other COAs include those 3 others, clinician-reported outcome assessments, which are also very common, where the clinician is using their interpretation to evaluate either a report or a rating of the patient's health status. There's observer-reported outcome assessments, which are used in cases where a patient may not be able to report for themselves. So they need, it could be a child who's just too young, or someone who's got cognitive impairment, or other types of impairment. So someone is observing their behavior, their signs, behaviors, and giving a rating on what they're observing, on how they are seeing the patient doing. They're not a clinician, though, so it's really meant to be something like a caregiver, a parent, a partner, who's giving their observation. Then the fourth one is a performance outcome assessment, and this is very different from the other 3. This is where the patient is given a task to perform, and they're evaluated using different metrics. Sometimes it's speed, sometimes it's distance, to tell how they're functioning in certain ways that are well-defined and according to a set of instructions. So it's a little bit artificial, but it actually gives us insight into how that patient is able to do certain tasks that apply to real-world activity.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. I mean, obviously, we're moving into this whole idea of getting more patient input or input from their caregivers, et cetera. And I always think about, for clinical research, we're saying, okay, did their lab value change? Did we see this with this when we put this in as an implant or something? How are these, Cheryl, being used in medical research now?
They've been used in medical research for decades, but they have become more and more important, especially since 21st Century Cures was enacted, because that really elevated the need for patient experience data to be included in clinical trial research. So the primary place that you'll see them is for constructing endpoints, which is the way that efficacy is evaluated in a clinical trial. So a primary endpoint, the main thing that the decision is based on, could be based on a clinical outcome assessment, such as abdominal pain, say in a GI condition. We might be more familiar with more biomarker type endpoints, say in oncology, thinking about tumor progression. But even within there's still opportunity to ask patients how they're feeling and functioning, or asking a clinician what their impression is of the patients changing over time. So in oncology, for example, patients can report on their symptoms. They can report on the impacts of the disease, the side effects of the disease, and the tolerability of the treatment itself. So you'll see that in endpoints. You'll also see it sometimes for screening or enrichment of studies to make sure that the trial is recruiting the people that the treatment is targeted to help. And you'll also see it kind of just for an assessment of the patient experience. Like I said, tolerability is a component of that. If the therapy works, but it's not very tolerable, that's a piece that regulators need to understand, and then the clinicians and patients who would ultimately be making treatment decisions also need to understand. So the COAs are all over in medical research, but sometimes they're just not the most obvious data point that we're used to seeing or looking for. But when they're there, they can be so informative, because they're really trying to give the information to the people who are ultimately making those treatment decisions about what their experience might be on that therapy.
And so when you're looking to come up with a clinical outcome assessment to measure the efficacy, what makes for a good one?
You need to have a measure that's reliable and valid. And that's true of any type of measure, but especially clinical outcome assessment. So, but in addition to that, it needs to be something that measures something that matters to patients. And I think that's become, as Cheryl was saying, with 21st century cures and the focus on patient experience data. And there's also another effort within FDA called patient-focused drug development, where there's so much emphasis on we need to understand how patients experience disease and what matters to them, what they want to see changed about it. Because historically, it's been more, in the past, there was a focus on what the clinician thinks need to be assessed and then evaluated and treated. But sometimes there's, a difference between what patients want and what the clinician thinks is important. And ultimately, we want the treatments to benefit patients. And so it really goes back to that clinical benefit idea. We want to be able to show that these treatments impact how the patient feels, functions, or survives. And we want to show improvement, ideally, and typically it's feeling and functioning. Those are the two that we focus on the most. And so as Cheryl mentioned, feeling typically is a symptom. Functioning is how the patient, has impact, how the symptoms impact their ability to carry out day-to-day activities, to function in their daily lives. Sometimes it's as simple as activities of daily living, like getting around the house, washing, cooking, cleaning, self-care. It's going to work. It's can they do their things that they want to do in terms of vacation, recreation, hobbies, etc. So it's really all-encompassing.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating area because I think about sometimes I've talked to some friends or folks who've been through various treatments. They end up, I did it, but it was really not what I probably should have done at the end because I didn't for whatever reason during going through that treatment and then experiencing it, didn't quite get what they were hoping for out of it. So I guess it's important to think about that. How is that then used? I mean, how is the system using that information? Does the FDA consider that and look at it in studies, et cetera?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So if it's positioned as an endpoint, and if it's a primary, secondary endpoint, the sponsor of that study is saying this is important, it's meaningful, and we want to be able to evaluate the treatment efficacy based on this. So you've got the statistical test kind of powering and adjusting alpha for the fact that we think that this is important information. So sometimes it's used by regulators because it's been positioned in a place where it must be considered. And in other times it can be used in a more supportive manner. So it can be put in as an exploratory endpoint, which is saying, we're going to run statistical tests, but we're not going to give as much emphasis on the p-value because it hasn't been controlled for multiplicity, but there's still information in there that's really important to be able to convey. And that information, it could end up in different locations. It could end up in the label. So you could be able to go in there and see straight from the prescribing information to see what those clinical outcomes looked like. But in other times, it won't get into the label. So you actually have to look for it. You have to look for it in review documents. There's a section about patient experience data and what type of information was considered in the review by the FDA. And so that's a place where you might see it show up where, they considered it and it was part of their weighing of the risk and benefit decision for approval or not. And then it also can show up in publications. So if it ends up in the review documents, you don't always necessarily get all of the information conveyed in there. It depends on what was submitted and then what was evaluated. But you can look at publications for a therapy and see if it's been reported there as well. So I keep coming back to oncology. For some reason, that's certainly not the only space that we work in, but in oncology, it rarely shows up in the label, the COA, the patient experience, because we know what those clinical and outcomes are that are based on tumor progression. And so that's what gets reported often. But if it does end up in the label, it'll still be in section 14 likely. But in oncology, that's where you might see a standalone publication where, the treatment's been approved and we know it's hit all those clinical check marks, but let's also find out how are the patients feeling and functioning on this therapy, because that's a place where you really have to, as a patient, weigh the risks and benefits for yourself with your own kind of equation that lives in your own body and mind. So that's out there. It just would require people to do a little bit more research. Maybe you have a friend like us that's in the field and can help point you towards that. Phone a friend. If you're not sure where those publications are, phone a friend to help you find that if you're trying to figure it out yourself.
For those just joining us, we're in the company of Cheryl D. Coon, PhD, Vice President of the Clinical Outcome Assessment Program, and Sonya Eremenco, MA, Executive Director of the Patient-Reported Outcome Consortium at CPEF. Stay tuned for the rest of the story.
So is there a push to move more of this into the label? I would think, asking people to search for it is tough. As a patient, trying to find this stuff might be difficult, but obviously it could be critically important for their own decision-making.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's so true. And that's an ongoing challenge between sponsors and regulatory agencies, because there is limited space. And that's what we keep hearing whenever we question, why aren't certain things making it into the label? Even if it does well in the trial, it doesn't necessarily guarantee it'll make it into the label. And it's a large part of space constraints. And so I know that FDA is looking at other ways to share this information. Going back to oncology, there's an Oncology Center of Excellence where they've had, I think it's called Project Patient Voice, where they were actually sharing clinical trial information publicly to help disseminate outside of the label publications. So, it's an ongoing challenge, because we completely agree. That's why we think it's so important to include these COAs in the trial, to collect the information, to then share it with clinicians and patients, because without that information, there's very little to go on when they're making that benefit risk analysis. They're making a decision on the treatment. And as Cheryl said earlier, the patients want to know how they might. There's no guarantee exactly how they all respond to it. They want to understand, how do other people respond? What are some of the side effects? I mean, especially in oncology, the side effects can be so debilitating.
Absolutely.
That people they really want to have as much information as they can to make an informed decision, or different side effects. Some treatments have really different side effects, and some may bother people more than others. And so having that information that can make that decision to treat, which of these, negative things is going to impact me worse. And maybe that helps with the treatment decision-making if the efficacy of the treatment is similar.
How is this being looked at and dealt with from a health literacy perspective? Are there specific things you're doing, Cheryl, in that area with these kinds of COAs?
When you're asking about, okay, the treatment works, but how do you feel while you're on the treatment? That it actually does get considered in a sense when we're talking about payers and reimbursement decisions. So in Europe in particular, they have a set equation where you get sort of a weighted score based on responses to a COA. It's called the EQ5D, and there are 5 dimensions that individuals rate themselves on, very, very broad dimensions, like functioning, and not specific to the therapy itself. And that's compared to the population. And the question is the new therapy providing enough benefit in terms of quality of life to justify the price? The one thing that's missing there is really tying this specifically to the patient experience, because a blunt, broad 5-item quality of life instrument is not really going to tie back to how that individual was feeling on treatment. And so that EQ5D that I mentioned, it's in almost every clinical trial, maybe every single one, because it has to go through that reimbursement process. But that's not usually what's used for assessing efficacy, because efficacy, as Sonya was saying, it really has to measure things that are important to the person who has that specific condition and the experiences that are associated with it. So I do wish that in this field, when it comes time to kind of weighing that cost benefit, that it was more, the benefits were really thought about more from the COAs that are specific to the condition than kind of the broad population. It gives you an idea for sure, but it's a bit of a disconnect from the work that people like Sonya and I are doing, really trying to get that patient voice quantified so that other patients can do their own cost benefit analysis themselves. And links back to what's meaningful to them.
So that gets right into this question, Cheryl. So thanks for bringing that up. And maybe I'll send this one to you, Sonya. How do you get the patient voice information? Where are you getting that from?
Well, we do a lot of research to get that information. As I mentioned earlier, my background is qualitative research, and that's a huge area and an effort that we undertake to get that patient information. These are one-on-one interviews that can be done in focus groups as well with kind of a different focus, but usually it's a one-on-one interview to basically ask them open-ended questions about their experience with diagnosis of the condition, what are the symptoms. We try to get into aspects of, what aspect of the symptoms are most important to measure, like is it severity, is it frequency, is it intensity, the timing, how often do we need to measure it, the recall. There's a lot of discussion about recall period and how far back can people recall their symptom experience or their, other things. We always talk about, do you remember what you had for lunch yesterday? Because a lot of people, don't remember common things like that. So it's done in a very rigorous manner. We have to do it in an unbiased way. We're asking questions that are not leading because we really want people to just talk about their experience. And then we do qualitative analysis to aggregate this information into themes and there is some counting of frequencies of reporting things. And we look for saturations. We look for how much, if we hear the same symptom from every patient, after a while, you don't keep asking because, we've gotten all the information we can. So there's not a hard and fast number of people that we interview. It's really more, we keep going until we keep getting the same information. We don't get new information. So that's saturation. That's another big thing that we talk about in qualitative research. And then once we drafted a measure based on that initial concept elicitation, I was describing concept elicitation. We draft items, we do cognitive interviews to then evaluate how well do people understand these items, the concepts, and then the other aspects, the response scales, and sometimes we even try to talk about meaningful change on these items. And I kind of want to tie this back to the health literacy question that you raised.
Great.
A big question is about, do people really understand these questions? And so we do a lot of work as we develop these measures to look at the reading level. And this is something the FDA pushes back on a lot. They're like, and sometimes it's a 6th grade, sometimes it's a 9th grade, somewhere in there is what we're aiming for, because we really want it to be understood by people with limited education, because we know not everybody in the population is well educated, and we need people to understand and read these on their own and be able to answer on their own. Health literacy is a next step because it's more about, do they understand health information? But we try to word these questionnaires in such a way that they don't need to have in-depth health information. They need to, it's written in very common language. We really want to make it accessible to everyone. And we even have questionnaires that children answer. So we have a project that we're doing in pediatric asthma where children as young as 8 are going to be answering a diary on their own. And we've done a lot of research to test our questions to make sure they can understand them. That's really where all these, how we get these COAs. And then there's a second phase, the quantitative testing that Cheryl, touched on, where we want to make sure that they have the right measurement properties so that we can, when there is a change that the people experience, it can actually measure and detect that change.
Mm-hmm. And
actually, can I tie that back to something that was discussed before, which is the information ending up in the label? There are times where sponsors use instruments in their clinical trials that haven't undergone that rigorous development process that Sonya just outlined. And in those cases, it might be information that was submitted to FDA for consideration, and FDA in their assessment decided this is not reliable enough to be able to use for regulatory decision-making. Hopefully in those cases, there are other endpoints that were available and they could make a decision based on those. But if that thorough process hasn't been used for developing the COA, it may not provide information that we should be basing regulatory decisions or treatment decisions on. So in the process that I mentioned earlier about going to first the label and then the review documents and then the publications, that's also where you might want to phone a friend who can help to evaluate if the rigor has been undertaken and if we can believe kind of the data that came out of the instruments themselves.
I've got one final question here in the final minutes. You mentioned the 5 questions the Europeans are using, or that 5 areas. Obviously, you can have a ton of questions and overload patients. I assume that's looked at. And is there an opportunity here to use some of the digital health tools for these kinds of things and gathering data?
So what you're speaking to is patient burden, and that's another big discussion topic that goes on because, in theory, you could come up with so many different questionnaires and ask hundreds of questions, and patients will get frustrated and overwhelmed and take to, and you don't want it to be so burdensome. So the ideal is to find the items and the questions that are relevant and asking things that are meaningful to them so that because what we've heard and seen is that when you're asking relevant questions, patients are happy to respond because they want their voice heard. They want to have this opportunity to share their experience. So there has to be, kind of a middle ground of getting enough information to make the decisions, as Cheryl was saying, without being repetitive or going, making it so burdensome. The digital tools, very big area of interest. There's a lot of research going on in this area because, again, there's concern, they are seen as less burdensome, especially if it's something like a watch that you can just wear on your day-to-day daily life, and it just measures your steps, and then you get this, automatic data download of what the activity was. Now you have to feel that there's reliability in that step count, and that it's not just counting the waving of a hand, because we've seen that happen.
Put it on your dog.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a lot of questions about how can we trust this digital data, but there's a lot of interest in using it. But at least my perspective is it's not going to it shouldn't replace the COAs. It needs to be done as a complement, because the digital data can't tell you things that are meaningful. It can't tell you necessarily what the person was doing when it was recording the activity. It can't tell you if the person was able to accomplish the task that they set out to do. Or they, how they feel, if they're satisfied, or, if they're struggling to do something. I mean, it might be able to tell how fast they went, and if they were slowing down, it can tell some things like that are important information. So I would advocate for using it as a complement so that we can have more information that helps shed light on the patient's experience.
Well, fantastic. I know we could get into much more about this, and probably need to get you both back on at some point in the future when you can actually find some time. You're both so busy. So thanks a lot, Cheryl and Sonya, for joining us on PopHealth Week.
Thank you so much. This was fun.
My pleasure.
And back to you, Gregg.
And that wraps up today's broadcast. We extend our appreciation to our worldwide listeners for tuning in, and our gratitude to Cheryl D. Coon, PhD, and Sonya Eremenco, MA, from the Critical Path Institute, aka CPATH, an organization leading collaborations to accelerate drug development and advance better treatments for people worldwide. Follow CPATH's important work online at www.c-path.org and on Twitter via @CPATHInstitute. If you enjoy our content on PopHealth Week, please show your support by giving us a thumbs up on your favorite podcast platform. Share it with your colleagues, and do subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. Remember, we're live on Healthcare Now Radio weekdays at 5:30 a.m., 1:30 p.m., and 9:30 p.m. Eastern. And for our friends on the West Coast, that's 2:30 a.m., 10:30 a.m., and 6:30 p.m. Pacific. From all of us at PopHealth Week, Fred Goldstein and myself, Gregg Masters, stay safe and stay tuned, and until next time, fare thee well.